Okay, so imagine this. You get home, you've had the longest day, right? And you are just starving. But you're trying to eat healthy. You know how it is. But there it is, sitting in your fridge calling to you. Leftover birthday cake, that little devil on your shoulder and the angel on the other telling you to resist. Ever feel that tug of war going on in your head?
Ah, yes.
That's Freud's model of the psyche, right there in action. We're going deep today, a real deep dive into the id, ego, and superego. These are the characters, you could say, that duke it out in the theater of our minds, our guidebook for all this. Excerpts from the ego and the id, straight from Freud himself.
What I think is so fascinating about Freud, even now, is that he gave us this system to make sense of these invisible things, these forces that are always shaping how we think and feel and what we do,
Hmm.
sometimes without us even realizing it.
Exactly. It's like we're not even totally in control up there, which is kind of wild when you think about it. So, should we start unpacking all of this then?
Lex.
Let's. First up, the I. Most people, when they hear I, they think instinct, primal urges, like that 2-year-old demanding candy, right?
True. The eye definitely runs on the pleasure principle, wants what it wants, when it wants it, no question. But Freud's ideas about the eye, they go way deeper than just being, well, kind of naughty or whatever. He said the eye, it's not just our own personal experiences, you know. It carries this weight of humanity's earliest experiences passed down through generations. So it's like we've got this hidden archive of our, I don't know, most basic urges, anxieties, all buried deep down, influencing us from the unconscious.
Okay, now that is both completely fascinating and also maybe a little creepy. It's like our worst impulses, they're actually ancient history playing on repeat.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. Freud said there are two main instincts that kind of rule the ID, eros and thanatos. People simplify eros as just the life instinct, but it's way bigger than just, sex drive.
Because eros also includes things like creativity,
Yeah,
right? And growth, that feeling of wanting to connect with people.
you got it. Think of how kids are always curious, exploring, learning, wanting to make friends. That's eros in action. It pushes us toward life, toward growing, creating.
That makes a lot of sense. But then there's Thanatos, which is the quote-unquote death instinct. And honestly, that one's always seemed a little ominous to me.
It's often misunderstood, for sure. Thanatos isn't literally like wanting to die,
Mhm.
but it's more a drive to go back to this state of total calmness, even nothingness, like we were before we were born. It's kind of like craving a break from all the noise and demands of the world.
So it's less about wanting to die and more about this longing for peace, a release from tension, like maybe even anxieties.
Exactly. This helps explain our love of repetition, routines, why we need to sleep. They all take us back to that feeling of stillness, even aggression, which we usually think of as like a bad thing. You can see it through this lens too, actually.
So when a toddler has a meltdown, which seems totally chaotic and destructive, it's actually their way of trying to, I don't know, regain control, to block out too much stimulation.
Precisely. They aren't trying to be bad, they're overwhelmed, trying to find their equilibrium, but in the only way they know how at that age. Which leads us to the ego, because as you can imagine, giving in to the id all the time, whether it's that cake craving or wanting to scream at someone, well, that wouldn't go so well in the real world.
Back again and still plumbing those depths, those psychological depths with Freud's model,
Oh,
the ego, and of course the superego. So we've got this powerful interrupt, right? This mix of life and death instincts, and it wants what it wants, like yesterday. How does the ego ever, I don't know, wrangle that, stop things from going totally off the rails?
well, Freud had this analogy, and it's pretty brilliant when you think about it. He said, imagine the ego is like a rider, yeah? And they're trying to control this super strong horse, and that's the ID. But, and here's the kicker, the rider, they can only control the horse by using that horse's own strength. It's a balancing act for sure.
Whoa, I like that. There's this constant tension, right? Like back and forth between what the id wants and what's actually doable in reality. It's like almost impossible, you know? Trying to steer a runaway train or something.
You got it. The ego has to be smart about it, figuring out ways to channel all that id energy. Sometimes it means delaying gratification. Other times it's all about compromise, all to handle those demands of, well, just living in the real world. That's why it's called the negotiator, right? But, and this is where it gets super interesting, the ego.
Hmm.
It's not totally conscious, you know what I mean? Like it's got its unconscious parts too.
Hold on. Really? See, I always thought the ego, that was basically our conscious mind, the part making decisions, interacting with everyone.
That's a really common misunderstanding, actually. Yeah, the ego does work in that conscious way, partly, but then it's got these unconscious elements too, and they're vital for us to, well, be psychologically healthy. Think of them as the ego's defense mechanisms, yeah. Like strategies it uses to protect our conscious mind from all those unacceptable iod impulses, like
Okay.
having a personal security guard for your mind.
So the ego's got this whole secret service team working behind the scenes. They make sure those primal urges don't like hijack our whole system. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And these defense mechanisms, oh man, they're fascinating to pick apart. For example, there's repression. That's when the ego just takes these impulses or sometimes memories, anything unacceptable, and just shoves it down out of our conscious awareness. It's like burying it deep, deep down so we don't have to deal with this head on.
Makes sense. Out of
Sad.
sight, out of mind, right? But if these mechanisms are so essential, how can we still end up feeling so, I don't know, conflicted, unhappy sometimes? Like, if the ego's supposed to protect us, why all the struggle?
You're asking all the right questions. And that, my friend, brings us to the third character in this inner drama that's always going on, the superego.
Ah, the superego. That's the one with the booming voice, the one always laying down the law, right?
Big time inner critic vibes from the superego.
You nail it. The superego, it's the internalized voice of all that moral stuff. The rules, what society expects, all that. It forms from our earliest experiences, mostly with our parents, and carries all their values, their baggage too. But, and this is important, the superego, well, it's not always right. Or fair, even. Oh, tell me about it. It really does feel like that inner critic is way harsher than, like, our parents ever were. It's like it took their worst fears, their anxieties, and then turned the volume way up, you know?
Exactly. And that brings us to, drum roll please, one of Freud's most famous ideas, the Oedipus complex. Now, this isn't just some, scandalous theory. It's actually crucial to understanding how the superego develops in the first place.
Okay, the Oedipus complex. Everyone's heard of it, but honestly, I'm not sure how many people could actually explain what it is. Break it down for us.
It's not as simple as, like, literally wanting to take the place of your same-sex parent, which is how some people see it. It's more this whole web of wanting both parents' love, their attention, and that creates a conflict inside the child.
So less about replacement, more about this, like, tangled mess of love, rivalry, that need for your parents to think you're, I don't know, awesome.
You got it. And it's right then, between 3 and 6 years old, that the superego really starts to solidify. The child is afraid of punishment, right, for all these messy feelings. So they internalize that fear, the rules, all the no-nos, and boom, you've got the foundation of the superego.
Which would explain why it can be such a harsh critic. It's lugging around all that early stuff, all that love and rivalry, the fear from way back when. No wonder it comes out swinging sometimes.
Exactly. And here's the thing. We all go through the Oedipus complex, each in our own way, of course. It's universal. What matters is how this whole thing shapes that superego voice, that inner critic that never seems to give up, the one that can be so unforgiving. It's brutal.
And I think so many people, they just don't realize where that voice comes from in the first place. They know they feel guilty or anxious, but they don't connect it back to, like, their childhood. But when you understand the Oedipus complex, it's like, oh, it all clicks into place. We can start to see how those really old patterns, how we related to our caregivers back then, how that still impacts our inner world now.
Exactly. And we're just scratching the surface here. Because when you start to get how the ego, and superego, all three, when you get how they play off each other, that push and pull between instinct, reality, and that internalized morality,
Right.
that's when you start to understand why humans do the things they do, even the things that make no sense. We can see how this system, which is meant to protect us, can actually lead to, well, huge internal conflict. Even what Freud called neuroses, those patterns that really mess us up, get in the way of living a good life.
And we're back, diving right back in. We've got the id, the ego, the superego, Freud's whole model of what's going on in our heads, and it's a lot. But what happens when this system, this whole thing kind of goes off the rails? Like when the ego, which is usually trying to keep things balanced, can't quite handle it all.
That's where we get to what Freud called neuroses. Basically, these patterns in how we think and act that cause real problems, they get in the way of just living a good life, having good relationships, all of that.
So it's like the system, the id, ego, superego, it just short circuits, all that internal back and forth. It's just too much.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Freud thought that these neuroses, they pop up when the ego's defense mechanisms, which are usually there to help, they become too rigid, too extreme. So instead of, adapting to what's going on in the moment, the ego gets stuck, like a broken record, playing the same patterns, even when they're not helpful anymore.
Okay, so get specific with me. What does a neurosis actually look like in real life? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Take OCD, for example. Obsessive compulsive disorder. We often think it's about being, like, super organized or clean, but it's way deeper than that.
Right, because it's not just about washing your hands or like alphabetizing your bookshelf, right? It's about what's behind those actions.
Exactly. At its core, OCD often comes from this place of unconscious guilt, you know, or anxiety that we're not even fully aware of. And the ego, trying to make the superego happy, to quiet all that guilt, it develops these rituals, these compulsions. It's like, okay, if I do this very specific thing, then maybe that bad feeling will go away.
So someone with a fear of germs, all that hand washing, that's their way to deal with those thoughts, right? Like they're trying to physically wash away those feelings of guilt or fear.
That's it. And the stronger the guilt, the anxiety, whatever's underneath, the more intense those compulsions get. It becomes this vicious cycle, the ego just trying to stay one step ahead of the superego's judgment.
Man, that's actually really helpful to understand it that way. It's not about being a neat freak or whatever. It's way more intense than that. It's about managing these really deep anxieties that the superego just won't let go of.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole thing, it can show up in so many ways. Think about someone who always needs reassurance from everyone. They need constant validation. That can come from that fear of the superego's judgment too. Like they need to prove they're worthy to make that guilt go away.
It's like the ego is, I don't know, begging the superego to chill out. See, superego, look, they
Right.
like me, so I must be okay.
Exactly. And this is why Freud's model is so important, even now, because it lets us understand these patterns, not just on the surface, but way down deep, those unconscious forces that are running the show.
So how do we fix it? If we see ourselves in all this, these patterns, these loops, can we break free?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
People are still debating Freud's work, figuring out all the answers. But I think one of the most helpful things he gave us is this awareness. Just by shining a light on these unconscious habits, just by knowing they're there, we start to get more control.
It's like we're not just puppets anymore, right?
Right.
Before we were just acting out these scripts we didn't even write. But if we're aware, then we have a chance to become, the authors of our own stories.
Exactly. And therapy, that's where it can make a huge difference. It gives you this safe space to really dig into these patterns, see where they came from, and find better ways to handle the whole id-ego-superego circus.
So it's not about getting rid of the ego, like deleting it or silencing the superego completely. It's more about like learning how to manage them, finding some peace in there.
Exactly. It's like helping the ego become a better rider, more skilled, so they can handle the horse's power without getting thrown off all the time.
Man, I love that analogy. It really speaks to how, like, this is ongoing work, right? It's this constant back and forth, always readjusting if we actually want to live a fulfilling life, not just, survive it.
Exactly. And remember what Freud said about the idea. All those urges, fears, that's not just you. That's echoes of our ancestors, the whole collective unconscious, everyone who's ever lived. We're all connected in a way.
Whoa. Okay, so you're saying if we figure out how to heal ourselves, if we find that peace inside, maybe we're actually helping everyone, like contributing to how humans evolve.
That's a big question, and I think ultimately it's one we each have to answer for ourselves. But it does make you think, right,
Yeah.
about how powerful this inner work really is. The more we get what's going on in our own heads, the more we understand the whole world, everyone around us, and our place in it all.
Now, that's a thought to carry with us. Huge thank you to our expert for, well, being our guide through all of this. Seriously, diving deep into the epist, ego, and superego. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. Remember, the most amazing discoveries, they're often right here inside ourselves. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.